report. Thank you very much for joining us. All of your microphones are muted for now, so please use the questions dialog box to ask questions of our presenters throughout the webinar and during the question period. We'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the briefing. A recording of this webinar, including slides, will be made available to all attendees. For any technical challenges, please use the questions dialog box, and we'll do our best to address your issues quickly. Now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator today, Jim Meyerly, co-founder and EVP of Strategy at Evolv, to introduce our presenters and begin the briefing.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining today. We're very excited to be continuing the discussion from the Q2 workforce report into the Q3 workforce report. So just quick on introductions. We've got Dr. Michael Hausman, our VP of Workforce Analytics. We've got David Osberg, our VP of Workforce Science. And then we've got me, Jim Meyerly, EVP of Strategy and the co-founder and moderator today. So just quick on I wanted to start really with kind of research methodology. And as we start the discussion today, really looking at, kind of where we're pulling data from and some kind of summary of the data that we have kind of available. So, we track data on applicants and employees throughout the employee life cycle. We then aggregate performance, retention, demographic, and behavioral data across those applicants and employees. This data then is gathered from a variety of different sources. Some of those are human resource information systems, performance management systems, point-of-sale systems, macroeconomic indices, and then also from our own psychometric measurement tools, psychometric instruments. We then use this data in order to decode key factors for workforce performance, common to many organizations regardless of industry. And today, the data that we'll be discussing today is extracted across 13 different countries, 18 different industries, and includes 121 million performance records. This data is then utilized in order to enable better workforce management across brands, including 20 of the Fortune 100. Okay? So kind of before we dig in, I'd like to set the stage of the scale of the workforce profitability opportunity for businesses. So as many of you know, the management of the hourly workforce is one of the most complex undertakings in business. More than 60% of the U.S. workforce is hourly, and an estimated 1.3 billion people around the world are part of the hourly workforce. Within this workforce, attrition is extremely high. 50% of hourly workers remain on the job less than a year. And we think that The Economist said it really well in a recent publication. I'd like to really read this quote. Considering that companies spend a fortune building a workforce, yet so many new hires don't work out, using data to improve how businesses hire, retain, and motivate employees can result in an outsized gain in corporate performance. And we believe this to the absolute core. This is, in many ways, the mission of Evolv, and you'll see this as we go forward today with some of our findings. Using data in order to decode the workforce and debunk workforce myths and intuitions can significantly improve profitability of how that workforce is selected, managed, and retained. So just as we get started today, we're gonna have a couple of polling questions. And so we'd like to start with the first one. So why don't we go to the polling question. So the first kind of polling question we have is, which of the choices below do you feel most significantly impacts profitability of your workforce? Reduced employee attrition, improved end customer satisfaction, improved business process efficiency, or something else? Let's give this about 30 seconds or so to see what your responses are, and then we'll share those responses, and then we'll move on to kind of the next section of the presentation today. Okay, great. So what we got is it looks like for the respondents, 63% said it was reduced employee attrition, 11% was it was improved end customer satisfaction, and it was 26% that said it was improved business process efficiency, and nobody said other. So that's great. I think it's relevant and germane for our discussion today because much of what we have elected to focus on for this Q3 workforce report is really focused on attrition insights. So with that, I'll turn it on over to you, David, to talk a little bit more about workforce science.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jim. And just my opinion, but I think during the next following questions, it'd be really nice to have some Jeopardy music in the background while people are responding.
For the Daily Double, huh?
For the Daily Double. Yep. Okay, well, great. So I just wanted to jump in and talk about initially the two main approaches that we most commonly see to workforce management today. So first, looking at the top workflow graphic on the upper half of the slide, there's the outdated but very common and traditional approach to making hiring, development, training, and management decisions that unfortunately involves primarily the use of subjective judgment through disconnected systems or disjointed data, intuition, and non-scientific testing or non-scientific criteria upon which people are hired or promoted or managed. And of course, although recruiters and hiring managers and managers typically have good intentions and want to do the right things, they're often making these decisions just based on what other people have done, but not really on what has been validated to work or for identifying what's going to really drive improved productivity or improved promotions or improved tenure outcomes. And unfortunately, a lot of these, although there are good intentions, there is unintentional bias or guesswork that drives poorer performance and greater attrition. And because these organizations or these individuals are not using reliable, quantifiable data as part of the equation to making these daily decisions, essentially these organizations in many ways are flying blind. But fortunately, and now moving towards the graphic on the bottom half of the slide, there really is a rigorous science that can be applied to choosing, managing, and retaining employees. And many big influential brands across the globe are currently moving or shifting to using workforce science and big data to make better decisions. So just to dive in a little bit more deeply, workforce science specifically is a discipline that allows us to measure skills, knowledge, competencies, motivation, and performance of the workforce throughout the entire life cycle of the employee. So from inception as an applicant all the way to when an individual is terminated. And interestingly, what is now a very rigorous, quantifiable science and becoming more so every day has its roots as recently as the last few decades or even centuries ago in such crazy concepts as handwriting analysis and brain measurement. So there have actually been documented cases where individuals are actually measuring people's skulls to try to better understand what is going to make them, or how they're going to perform, how they're going to behave in various situations. And of course, over time, scientists started to understand and better demonstrate the value of measuring individual differences or individual traits, such as, say, cognitive aptitude, hard skills, and personality. But even as recently as the 1990s, and the advent of the growth of the internet and computing power, the first generation of online tools tended to focus on really simplistic things such as resume scoring and just automating basic job applications. But of course, with the rise of the internet and computing power, some real innovations in measurement tools and job simulations, and of course, the rise of big data analytics, those have all really leapfrogged our ability to understand the real factors that drive performance and employee retention at an enterprise scale. And interestingly, this big data and these more rigorous approaches to data measurement of human performance and potential, that's really allowed us to identify what drives these positive outcomes, and it's also allowed us to debunk some very long-held assumptions about what people should be making hiring or management decisions on. We actually talked quite a bit about this in our previous Q2 workforce report, where we dove into details about misconceptions around making hiring or management decisions on previous experience, on a person's criminal history or their history of job hopping or their technical skills, those kind of things. So not only are these database and workforce science approaches helping us really better understand what are the key factors that drive positive outcomes, such as improved productivity and employee retention, they're also allowing us to see how misguided some of the traditional approaches have been. And those things have been very interesting and often very eye-opening, not only to us, but to our clients. And going back to the excerpt that Jim mentioned from The Economist, these more advanced measurement and data analytic approaches have essentially unlimited opportunities for improving business outcomes at every stage of the employee lifecycle and really at every level within the organization. So now I want to hand this off to Mike Hausman, again, our VP of Workforce Analytics, so he can talk through how we've quantified the influence of a variety of key factors that shape workforce performance.
Thanks, David. So what's interesting is that these days data on the workforce is more abundant than ever, and yet employers with sizable workforces are still using the wrong factors when it comes to evaluating the contributors to attrition and performance. Unfortunately, as David had mentioned, they're still relying on gut feel and intuition. So with that in mind, we sought out to answer a single question: why do employees leave? And what's remarkable is that we're able to answer this and quantify this using data-driven techniques for the first time. So using a combination of big data analysis, psychometric tools, econometrics, and machine learning, we've been able to reveal the surprising factors that yield lower workforce churn and better work performance outcomes. And we're able to quantify the degree to which these factors influence attrition and performance. Now, we've bucketed all of those factors within 5 categories that you see in front of you. I should point out that this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list. It's a list of factors that fit 2 criteria. First, they're captured within our database. And second, these things are somewhat counterintuitive and surprising. And so what you'll see is that there are those 5 categories. And going in order from most significant to least significant, we start with workplace relationships. Those are relationships that employees form with their managers, with colleagues, co-location within the office space, as well as relationships with subordinates. Macroeconomic trends. These are things like local wage rates, unemployment rates, gas prices, walkability. These are what economists would call exogenous factors. Company practices. So these are practices and policies the companies themselves have around things like referrals, work at home, so on and so forth. There are, of course, job characteristics. This is the nature of the job itself, the vertical that it's within, the skills that are required, and essentially what the day-to-day work looks like. And then finally, there are worker characteristics. Those are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that the worker themselves brings into these roles. And what's interesting, and the key takeaway here, is that without question, workers matter. However, workers don't matter nearly as much as the relationships they form with their colleagues, managers, and so on and so forth. So what we could take away from this is that no man is an island. That, again, workers matter, but they exist within a social fabric at the workplace. And when we're thinking as employers about how we can keep employees longest, these identify the low-hanging fruit. And quite frankly, where you would want to dig in first are those relationships. And so essentially that's where we're going to dig in first. What we're looking at here are workplace relationships. We've done a lot of work around those relationships, studying again relationships with colleagues, with managers, subordinates, and so on and so forth. And what our analysis has found is that relationships with those managers specifically influences employee tenure more than every other factor. We found in our own studies that the best managers are 5 to 6 times better at retaining their employees than the least proficient managers. That gap is huge. And applying that analysis to, say, an employer with 25,000 employees, we found that up-leveling the bottom quartile of managers would save $2.3 million. And these gaps are enormous. And what we found are the effects are similar on the performance side. Managers are so critical to employee performance that their influence is actually greater than the employees themselves. In other words, whether you show up to work on time is driven more by your manager than yourself. So it's long been said that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And now we can accept this wisdom because it can be quantified and understood. So given the profound impact of managers, there's a logical next question, which is, what makes someone a good manager? What impacts managerial performance? That's something that we researched with our research partners at Wharton and Yale. We found preliminarily that, for example, tenure doesn't matter, whereas pay does. Higher paid managers perform better. And in the Q4 workforce report, we're actually going to be digging in sort of a great deal of depth into this finding and trying to understand what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that make someone a good manager. Great. So macroeconomic factors. This, as I mentioned, are local unemployment rates, wage rates, walkability scores, so on and so forth. So just to set the frame for this, the cost of hourly attrition is huge. It's greater than U.S. Medicaid spending, and it's on par with defense spending. So we all know that a disengaged workforce is a problem, but most companies aren't truly aware of the cost of that workforce to their bottom line. What we found is that the cost to hire and train an hourly employee averages $3,500, and lost productivity from that employee leaving as a result of a poorly matched hire adds another $3,000 to $10,000 to that equation. So we've analyzed data from the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey, and it's revealed 2 things. One, we know that attrition over the last few years has been low by historical standards. Second, what this suggests is that attrition is going to rise, and attrition will be an even bigger problem in the future than it is today. As the economy improves, we know that employees leave more voluntarily, and so we're seeing an increase in that voluntary turnover rate. And assuming that we revert to historical means in terms of attrition, the cost of attrition will undoubtedly increase in comparison with the last 4 years.
Great. So we'll do another, we'll stop there for just a moment too and do another polling question. So for this one, which of the below factors most significantly impact employee performance and tenure on the job? Office proximity to amenities, employee distance to work, or regional gas prices? Again, we'll give you just 30 seconds or so to respond, and then we'll share results, and then Mike will share some conclusions as well, based on that. Okay, very interesting. All right, so 31% say it's office proximity to amenities, 69% say it's employee distance to work, and 0% say regional gas prices. So Mike, we'll turn it on over to you for the next one.
Yeah, so we can actually answer this question using our data as well as our econometric techniques. So distance to work, gas prices do matter, but what we found in the course of our analysis is that walkability and proximity to amenities is actually the single strongest factor that influences attrition. So everyone's heard the real estate mantra, location, location, location. What we found is that this is actually very important to office office locations as well. So distance to daily amenities, dry cleaning, restaurants, so on and so forth, those are measured by a metric called walking score that ranges from 0 to 100. And that walking score is a stronger predictor of attrition than other factors like distance to work. Locations with high walking scores retain employees 58% longer than locations with low walking scores. So this is something to consider the next time you're scouting an office location. And what's interesting is that this is a factor that influences workforce attrition outcomes, but the individual who would most likely be responsible for choosing a new site isn't necessarily someone that would sit within your HR function. So it's critical to engage that person in this conversation in order to promote the best workplace outcomes. So now I'll hand it back over to David, and he can talk a little bit more about that chunk of the pie company practices.
Great. All right, thanks, Mike. Okay, as Mike mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more over the next couple slides about various company practices that impact employer productivity or retention. And specifically, when we're referring to company practices, we're talking about things such as how people are assessed, how they're hired, how they're trained, whether they can work from home or they need to come into an office every day. Are there referral practices in place? And of course, there's a variety of other operational and HR-related policies or practices that can influence these types of outcomes. But of course, company assessment practices, both in the pre-hire stage when people are getting evaluated for hiring purposes, and post-hire when they're being assessed for their perceptions of culture, how they feel about their levels of engagement, whether or not they feel like they're supported by their managers and fellow employees, those kind of things. So different types of assessments or evaluations to help better understand their perceptions. These different types of assessments have a powerful effect on performance and tenure outcomes, but of course, those data are only valuable if the right questions are being asked. We know, as do probably everyone on the phone or on the webinar, know that the use of assessment tools, particularly within the hourly realm, has grown dramatically over the last couple of decades. But job applicants, in particular, have also become more aware or more sophisticated in how they handle dealing with these types of assessments and how they respond to these different types of tools. And unfortunately, many of the tools on the market today, and many that are in wide use, are unintentionally transparent, meaning that in many cases, perceptive applicants are able to figure out what's the desirable response or what are the desirable traits that employers are looking for. And therefore, in many cases, these pre-hire assessments may be ineffective or worse. They may actually be counter-predicting or counterproductive in helping identify who's really going to succeed or stay with the organization long term. Along that point, in many cases, although employers have great intentions for capturing good data on applicants or capturing good data on employees, in some ways, by putting transparent assessments or tools into place, they may actually be prescribing or dictating how applicants are actually going to behave or respond in the application process, and therefore they're circumventing getting the valuable data that they're actually really looking for and needing to make better decisions. As one example, we found that 7 out of 10 self-proclaimed rule followers using a Likert type scale, which is very common and, in my opinion, not a highly effective way to capture data in certain instances, 7 out of 10 self-proclaimed rule followers were actually eventually terminated for reasons related specifically to rule breaking or to not following policies. So, of course, in this case, that scale or that type of measure was actually completely or almost completely ineffective in achieving what it was designed to do. So therefore, we really recommend that employers embrace more innovative approaches to measuring applicant and worker traits, and to be really careful about what types of tools you're choosing, both in the pre-hire and in the employee assessment or measurement phases or stages. And it's critical that you demand that your partners or your vendors are able to use data to demonstrate the ROI and the impact that these tools are actually having on improving the outcomes that organizations are interested in, such as productivity and improved retention. So moving on to the next slide, talking a bit more about company practices. And in this case, this is about setting expectations or making sure individuals know what they're signing up for when they're applying for a job. And this can certainly apply to current employees who are looking to be promoted or looking to make job changes. But key point here is that sugarcoating the realities of a job or an opportunity up front, particularly in the recruiting and onboarding processes, can oftentimes backfire later on or have dire consequences. For example, we all know that resumes typically contain exaggerations, and they're not a great source of reliable data. But oftentimes, job descriptions also contain exaggerations, or they sugarcoat the realities of what a job is really about. We actually found that between 1/3 and slightly over half of all new hires that we were studying felt misled or confused about various key aspects of a job, including primarily shift availability, compensation and bonus structures, and advancement potential. And thus, the vast majority of attrition that happens in, say, the first two or 3 months, especially in hourly jobs, is driven by misaligned expectations. So, I mean, let's think about it. So what happens when you oversell an opportunity to a job applicant? New hires become disappointed and disenchanted with the job, and they develop a level of distrust for the organization. Morale amongst these new hires can seep into other realms of the organization. Your employment brand takes a hit. Again, word gets out. Applicants say, hey, this is not a company that we can really believe in, or the job is not nearly as good as it sounds. And as a result, you get stuck having to hire more people than you actually need because your early stage attrition is going to be really high. And we found that upwards of 20% of workers quit within the first 30 days, specifically because they felt like they didn't understand what they were actually getting into, or they felt like they were promised something that wasn't actually available or a reality of the job. Okay, so what's the solution on that? It's actually really fairly straightforward, but there are a lot of nuances on how to present information in a really valuable way and in a way that applicants are going to be able to digest what's most important to them. So first of all, transparency throughout the process is critical. You want to lay out what are the drivers of employee satisfaction and engagement, what really makes people excited about a specific job. And then also, it's equally as important, if not more important, to identify the aspects of the job or the work environment that are really challenging for some individuals or that may be driving attrition. And you want to be able to address these when a person is in the stage where they can still make a decision about whether or not they want to actually complete a job application or take the job. When we put comprehensive, visually based, realistic job previewing into a job application process and then polled a wide variety of new hires, we found that over 90% of the new hires felt that they had a clearer picture of the reality of the job, and that included their advancement potential, their understanding of the compensation, of the shifts that were available when they were lower on the totem pole as new hires, and that has an immediate, dramatic impact on short-term early attrition. And not only is there this positive impact coming from aligning expectations, but there's something that we call the vaccination effect. And this is just really an outcome of telling people about the potential challenges that they'll run into, sort of the downsides of the job, because not every job is always fun. And when somebody knows that they're going to be facing challenging situations or difficult scenarios in interacting with customers or coworkers, and you lay that out for them before they've made a decision to take the job, when they do take the job and they move into that, they're going to have a much higher level of readiness and resilience for those negative or challenging situations. And that is one of the components that helps drive improved employee retention early on. So now I want to hand this back to Mike to talk a bit more about our findings on job characteristics and worker characteristics.
Great. Thanks, David. So as I mentioned, one of those pieces were job characteristics, and those constitute essentially the nature of the role itself, the day-to-day, the vertical that it's in, the skills that are required, so on and so forth, as well as where the job is performed. So work-at-home policies have been highly debated throughout the last year, in part because of Marissa Mayer's decision to make Yahoo employees work from the office. Well, data is able to settle that debate. Within our network, we have a large amount of data from both work-at-home and non-work-at-home employees, and what we're able to do is analyze attrition and performance among those employees. What we found is that median tenure for work-at-home employees is 28% higher than their counterparts that work from the office. Now, what about performance? Well, when we dig in one measure of productivity, what we found is that performance is about on par for the two groups. However, work-from-home employees, about 90 to 120 days into their employment, their productivity dips slightly. And when we weigh those two factors out, what we find is that the value of that slight dip does not outweigh the increased median tenure as a result of work from home. So on the balance, it would appear that work from home is actually a good policy that keeps employees longer and produces roughly comparable levels of performance.
Okay, great. Mike, all right, so we've got one more and final polling question. So that's this. For which of the below roles does the browser you use indicate whether you'll be an effective employee? So really, with the browser that you're using when you're applying for a position, indicate whether you'll be an effective employee. Technical support roles, sales roles, cashier roles, or all the roles listed above. We'll give you 30 seconds or so, and then we'll come back with results. Great. All right, so the results show 33% for technical support roles, people thought, 7% for sales roles, 7% for cashier roles, and 52% thought that the browser you use actually does matter as a predictor of performance outcomes. So great. Mike?
Great. Yeah, and our results essentially are that what we found is that use of technology, measured in a variety of different ways, is predictive of attrition and performance across essentially every type of role. And so now we're digging into worker characteristics. We're looking at the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they bring to the role, as well as, for example, their technological capabilities. What we found is that technological capacity and aptitude is one of the strongest predictors of tenure and performance on the job. And again, this holds true even for non-technical roles. Now, we've analyzed this in 3 different ways. First, we've looked at technical proficiency as a function of computer familiarity. We'll ask questions like, what's the keyboard shortcut for cutting and pasting text? And what we found is that employees with high technical proficiency stay 37% longer on the job, and they miss 15% less days at work. Second, we look at willingness to adopt new technology. And as Jim had mentioned, we've looked at that as a function of browser usage. Certain browsers come at default with computers, and then there are other browsers that must be custom installed. What we found is that that's actually an extremely powerful predictor of performance across virtually every performance metric that we analyze. It's actually one of the most robust findings that we've uncovered. And third, we look at social network usage. So by asking people how many social networks they're using, what we found is that that actually demonstrates very high correlation with performance on the job. Now, this is particularly true within roles that are technology-enabled and social in nature. And so we found that social network usage can serve as a proxy for understanding someone's technical proficiency as well as their willingness to adapt new technologies. So taken together, these results actually suggest that recruiters, when evaluating job applicants, may be better served by looking at an applicant's laptop instead of their resume. Now I'll hand it off to Jim, and he can moderate questions from the audience.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Mike. So, that concludes really the presentation component of the webinar today. At this point, we wanted to take the remainder of our time really to turn it over to the audience for questions and questions that Mike and David can help to respond to. So there's a within your webinar window, there's the ability to type in questions. We'll take just a minute or two in order to tabulate those questions, and then we'll start the Q&A session for the remainder of our time.
So we have a few questions from the audience, and some of these questions too were asked by multiple folks, so excuse me if I'm paraphrasing. So one question, how do you gather the data, and where does the data come from? What different systems do you use?
Sure, I'll jump in there. So the data emerges primarily from three sources. So the first is our clients themselves. We'll gather, in the course of an engagement, data from their HRMS, human resource management systems, as well as their performance management systems, along with any other data we can on those employees, their supervisor, shifts, wage rates, so on and so forth. Really, everything is available. So that's one source of data. We supplement that with data that we gather via our own psychometric tools, and David can go into more detail about that. But we're essentially actively surveying and polling the employee workforce at all stages of the life cycle, at the point of application, throughout their training and development, and ultimately as a point of separation. And we supplement those two sources of data with a third data set, and that's publicly available data. So this is data that we are able to gather from the Census Bureau, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from organizations that publish walkability scores and gas prices. And so all of those three sets of data we wrap together, and that's the core of the data that we use to perform our analyses.
Yep, and this is David. I'll jump in just to talk a bit more about the psychometric data capture tools that we often use. In many cases, when we start working with clients, there's a great deal of excitement about all of the data that they're currently capturing, and then we get on site, or we start working with them, and we find out that in many cases, the data are not as robust or as available as we would hope or as was conveyed. Again, there's that sugarcoating component. So we've developed a variety of tools to help measure potential and perceptions for both pre-hire and post-hire. On the pre-hire end, we have a variety of different tools that we use across that are applicable across a wide variety of jobs to measure competencies, interests, motivation, skills, both soft and hard skills. And we do these using a variety of different item formats and approaches, from forced choice items to measure personality and work style, to some really cool interactive simulations and job scenarios. Then, of course, capturing metrics once a person is hired, as soon as they're brought in on day one of onboarding, all the way through to when the individual departs the organization. So we want to capture information on what are their perceptions on day one of the recruiting process and of their interactions throughout the application process. What are their perceptions of the training environment and the effectiveness or pace or relevance of training? What are their perceptions of their trainers and their supervisors, their coworkers? Do they feel like they're getting the right level of support and development over time? Do they feel engaged? Are there things that are potentially making them think about leaving the organization, or that are driving their frustration, or that they're hearing about maybe influencing others in a positive or negative way? And then, of course, we have some innovative tools that we use to capture really detailed, real information about what's actually driving real turnover, because we know, of course, as industrial psychologists, that turnover intentions can often be very different from what actually drives turnover. And again, as we talked about that data capture life cycle earlier on, making sure that we have really good data, not only early stage when a person is on a job, but even later, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months into their their stint as an employee, and why are they leaving? That's really critical, and our clients really tend to value that information, and helps uncover a lot of valuable information to make better decisions, and to make sure that some of those commonly held assumptions or practices that are in place are either replaced or are validated in terms of being valuable or not.
So a related question, actually, what industries do we look at across our network? There were a number of questions on data related to specific industries.
Sure. The short answer is a lot of them. So the data is gathered on the hourly workforce, but in terms of the types of verticals and industries that these employees work within, it ranges from, retail to telecommunications to electronics, there's, hospitality. It really is a sort of wide array. Now, what we also do when we're running these models is we control for that industry. So, within these, we're controlling not only for the nature of the role, whether it be a front office or back office position, customer service, so on and so forth, but we're also controlling for that vertical in order to make sure that the results that we're presenting here are an apples-to-apples comparison, that they're a true readout of the impact of work-at-home policies or technical proficiency. I should add, actually, additionally, I didn't mention this before, we're also looking at roles within logistics, construction. I think the referrals white paper that we just published covered, it was call center agents as well as long-haul truckers. What's interesting about it is that across those two very different employee populations, we actually find incredibly similar trends in referral policies. And so that's something we find to be true of a lot of hourly positions, that there's certain core things like your manager, his or her influence on performance that hold true regardless of which industry or vertical we're talking about.
So there's a few questions on what does and doesn't predict employee success. So one question asked, can you share some more examples of some common screening practices in hiring, for example, GPA, that actually are predictors of employee success and some that are not? And there was some previous findings in other workforce reports that might shed a little bit more light on that.
Yep. Sure, so I can jump in, and Mike, please feel free. But as mentioned before, and what we covered in our Q2 workforce report were some of the myths that our data debunked. Some that I think are most interesting because they're most commonly held are specifically related to hiring people based on previous experience. In many cases, when we're first dealing with clients, they say, the minimum qualifications that we have in place for this role is that a person must have, for example, 1 year of customer service or 1 year of sales experience. And we say, okay, why is that? What evidence do you have that that's actually relevant? and there's oftentimes pushback. Then over the course of time, when working with that client, we look at data, we look at their data, or we look through our network, and we found consistently that experience was not a driver of improved productivity or retention. And when you think about it, for these lesser skilled roles, it really makes sense. In many cases, some of the poorest employees, say in a customer service role, may either get fired or they'll quit because they're unreliable or they don't, have high levels of commitment. And so what do? They go to another employer and they apply for basically the exact same type of customer service role. The person or the hiring manager says, oh, great, this person has experience as a customer service rep, but what they don't realize, because in many cases they don't do reference checks, or oftentimes reference checks are just not reliable or factual, that this person was a really poor customer service rep. Just an example of how previous experience does not differentiate someone who's going to be, a higher performing individual. A couple others, we found that individuals with criminal backgrounds, of course, in many cases, employers do not want to hire people with a misdemeanor and, more seriously, a felony on their background. But we found that in many cases, those individuals that did have some sort of criminal history actually performed slightly better. It was only about 1% better than those without criminal histories or a criminal past. But the really interesting thing there is not that there was a wide difference in the performance outcomes, but really that those individuals who didn't have a criminal history weren't dramatically better employees. They were actually slightly inferior. So again, another thing that was a predictor of an outcome that was counter-intuitive, similar to job hoppers. I know I personally, when I'm interviewing people, I'm very curious about how many jobs they've held. Granted, that's for a different type of role, but in the hourly sector, we, again, consistently found that people who had a history of job hopping didn't actually have more negative productivity or retention outcomes. But of course, the caveat there is by going through our system, they were given a much more clear understanding through the realistic job preview and through job simulations about what the job entailed, what the hours were, what the compensation was. So they were able to make a more informed decision about the job that they were taking, and that led to greater outcomes. Mike, is there anything you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think the takeaway for me from a lot of these studies is that what predicts someone's likely to stay on the job and perform well isn't necessarily where they've been in the past. It's where they are today and whether they're a good fit for this future role. That's why when we're digging into things like technological proficiency and we're trying to understand via non-transparent questions their current personality attributes and their behavioral traits, those are much stronger predictors of someone's future performance than, say, their previous history at other employers in roles that may or may not be similar to the one that they're applying for. So it's really important to take that in at the point of application and not to penalize someone for a work history or experience that doesn't look, ideal.
Yeah, and going to something that's a little more conceptual or soft in relation to competencies, that's less concrete, I would say, than some of the other factors that we just talked about. When we were working with some subject matter experts on developing content for different types of roles that were really focused on sales-type behaviors, one of the scales that we had developed was around creativity and innovation, because for some of these customer service sales roles, some of these subject matter experts consistently said, we just want someone who's going to follow the rules, who's not going to try to go out on their own and do things their own way. So we thought as a good distractor scale, we would develop a scale to measure creativity, because a lot of times people who are highly creative want to do things their own way, and we thought those would be, that would be a good way to screen people out potentially once we had good data behind it. We actually found the opposite, that individuals who scored highly on our creativity scale were some of the best, most consistent top performers in these customer service and sales roles, and that is now a component of some of the scoring that drives the algorithms for identifying people who are going to be particularly productive in specific types of roles.
So just, I guess, one more question, and this is really around the relationship between executive decision-making and data. So I guess there were a number of questions on this. So to summarize, what is the role of executive experience and gut decision-making and using your brain versus using the data, and how can those two relate to each other?
Sure.
This is a small question.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And I think the answer is that it shouldn't be all one or the other. So, we don't think that decisions should be made purely on the basis of gut intuition and feel. At the same time, it shouldn't necessarily be made purely on the basis of data. There are, corner cases and exceptions to every rule. And so what we advocate is that there be a combination of the two, that data be used to generate insight and offer up information that can be used to help with this decision-making process, but ultimately, the end user, that executive or hiring manager or HR manager, whatever the case may be the one that used that information to arrive at their decision. David, any thoughts on that one?
No, just a summary, really. I mean, when I think about it, a mentor and, well-respected industrial psychologist that I've worked with for years, Dr. David Scarborough, has always said that data should be used as a decision support tool. It should never be used in a vacuum, and I think that sentiment really sums it up.
Great. Well, just in the last few minutes that we've got, for those with questions on what Evolv does for our clients, I'd recommend that if you have any additional questions that you contact us after the presentation today, and we're happy to go into those in a little bit more detail. Just a quick kind of 2 seconds on Evolv. We are a big data company that optimizes the business performance of the workforce, and we do this via a configurable cloud services platform. We improve our customers' overall workforce profitability as measured by things like reduced attrition, much of which that we talked about today, improved service quality, more efficient and effective revenue and performance metrics, and we do this across industries and verticals. So we appreciate the time today. We welcome any other questions that you have, and thank you again for attending. We'll publish a version of this webinar as well, and we'll send that out following the discussion today. So appreciate the time, and looking forward to coming back together when we share results for the Q4 workforce report.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.